This is a quick video to show you how to use OSM to do your risk assessments. I'll dive straight into OSM, show you where the risk assessment is, and then go back through OSM to see the details of how risk assessments are stored and recorded. So a risk assessment is associated with doing some kind of activity, and in OSM, activities are divided into two types of categories under your program and your events. There's one risk assessment for each meeting. So I'm going to take a look at this meeting here. Cooking on bean tins on the outgang. Got a summary here. Go to outgang, feather some sticks and use them to cook on bean tins. So there are some risks associated with those three activities. Crossing a road, we're going to be using knives to feather sticks, and we're going to be using bean tins to light a fire. So let's associate some risks with those activities and create the risk assessment. So on this column here, we have the risk assessment section. Click that. We now have a blank risk assessment form. A big advantage of using OSM is that you'll have created a library or database of risks and hazards. This button here implies as much. Use existing entry. Click that, and that will take you into the library or database. And this drop down will enable you to navigate to the risk assessment that you need. Now, the first time you use OSM to do risk assessments, if you go to this drop down box, it'll be empty because you've not made any entries. So we'll look at how you deal with that shortly. But I've already created some entries, some activity entries. They're in categories. And my first risk identifies leaving the scout hut and crossing the road. I've created a category called Heslington and Surround. So these hazards are hazards that are associated with being local but outside the scout hut. Sure enough, I've got crossing the road, so I'll select that. You're now offered two buttons to choose between, a link button and a copy button. The link button will link the hazard in your risk assessment back to the original hazard in the database or library. If you use that button, somebody makes changes to that original entry in the database or library, it'll change it in your risk assessment. So probably better always to use the copy button. This will make a copy of the original risk assessment. You can then edit and it'll make no changes to the original and make no effect on anybody else's risk assessments for any of their meetings. So select copy. And this risk assessment is copied into your page. So let's just have a look at how it's organized. Across the top here is the category, and this is the activity, crossing the road at Heslington. Who's at risk? What controls are you putting in place? If you're happy with that, you can proceed, but it doesn't quite say what I plan to do. I'm not going to use leaders to hold scouts at the curb. I'm going to let patrol leaders do that. So I want to edit this slightly. And here you'll see an edit pencil. You can click that or anywhere in the hazard region, and you can now edit the entry. So I'm going to make some changes. That hazard is now entered into the risk assessment for this particular meeting. So the next activity I associate with this meeting is feathering sticks. So we want to be looking at some kind of hazard involving knives. Click the drop down and we can see there is a category with knives, axes and saws. Cuts and stabs are obviously a risk. Whittling is certainly suitable for feathering sticks. Click that. Don't choose link, choose copy. Yep, that all makes sense for whittling. Happy with that. I shall just see if there are any other entries. I think there was another entry for knives, cuts and stabs. Probably going to use that entry for any activity involving knives. So select that, copy, cuts and stabs. That sounds about right. I might edit that later. The third activity is lighting the bean tin. Got the fire category and sure enough there's bean tins. Click that, copy, check it through. Just go back to the entries and see if there's any more associated with fire, burns and smoke. Copy it in. So that kind of all makes sense and save. You may associate other hazards with this activity, but for simplicity, we'll leave it there. So returning to the OSM screen where you enter your risk assessments, you may find that you haven't got a risk assessment in the library that suits your requirement. So you're going to need to add a new entry. Temptation is to click this button here. Don't. An event added here will only apply to this particular activity. It will not show up in the database and therefore you can't reuse it at some future point. So I'll show you how to add an entry that is visible to every meeting. In other words, an entry that's added into the database or library. Rather than looking at any particular event or meeting, go to the Your Program overview of your meetings and you'll see another link to a risk assessment on this horizontal tab across the top. Click that, and this will show you your complete library or database of activities that have been completed so far. If you want to add an entry here, it will then be reusable across all future meetings. So this is the screen, the program screen, program risk assessment tab, where you should enter all new activities, certainly any activities you're going to encounter again. To create a risk assessment for any particular program or meeting, go to the meetings, select the meeting, use existing entry. Don't forget that if you add an entry here, it won't be recorded on the database and won't be available for future use. To create your library, go to your program and remember to go to the horizontal risk assessment here and add entries from this point. You can collapse your categories so you can navigate your way around quickly. You can edit an entry. You can delete an entry using the waste bin. So that's where you'll start when you're adding your first entries. There's one very final important point you do need to know, that there are actually two libraries or databases. There's a library for your program, which is the one we've been working in. There's an identical library, but with different entries in the events section of OSM. You'll find it in exactly the same way using the horizontal tab bar at the top. Click Risk Assessments, and you'll see that there are some very different entries in the library for your events. Hope you found that useful and that you're now better prepared for making risk assessments in OSM.